Horror movies for centuries have entertained us, thrilled us, and terrified us. Ghosts, demons, monsters, and even human beings have horrified their way into our hearts, our souls, and the very fabric of our society. For the next few months, join me as we take an in-depth look into horror with the History of Horror series. What's up, guys and gals? Thank you guys for joining my channel today. I am super excited. I hope you guys are too. We are starting the History of Horror series, starting with the silent years. Going from late 1800s to the late 1920s. So before I get started, I want to give a shout out to a few people. I had a Facebook question on the Facebook page a few months ago asking what year the first horror movie came out. Scott McLaughlin, Brandon Mosley, Matt Deal, Ryan Ottenberg, and Kim Rosen, you guys are correct. 1896 was the year that the first horror movie came out, and it was, get this, 3 minutes and 19 seconds long. The entire movie is on YouTube. It's called La Maison du Diable, translating to The House of the Devil. It's a French film. So, over in France is where horror started for the most part. So, what we need to think about for a second is what was going on back then. Now, being silent, they didn't have much to do with. They didn't have much to bring forth. In horror, you want to touch as many senses as possible, but the only sense you can touch in a silent film is a visual. So, but the good thing was, at that point, they had never seen anything like it. Some of these shots are just like a bat floating around. It was, looking at it now, it looks very cheesy. You can tell it's a bat on a string, just kind of jumping back and forth. But back then, it was horrifying to people. To see a skeleton on screen, that was horrifying to people. And this movie was re-released in the UK and also re-released in the United States a few years later. Now, about the United States was a little bit late in the game by comparison. It wasn't until 1896 that the United States released their first horror movie called A Cavalier's Dream. That was in 1897. So, for us, as far as movies that we would have heard of, there's not a lot of deep information on the movies back then because it was so long ago. The first one that really struck gold was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1908, and that movie did so well that they re-released it in 1912. No, not even. I'm sorry, they didn't even re-release it. They redid it again in 1912, 1913, 1920 twice. That's how much of an impact that movie had. And the thing about that movie, why it was so groundbreaking, because it took a mild-mannered individual and then flipped them into something absolutely hideous and absolutely terrifying. It was based on a book, a novel in the earlier 1800s, and that's where it came from. But Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you guys have heard about that, I'm sure. In 1910, we had our first iteration of Frankenstein. Now, it's not the Frankenstein we know and love. It looks way different than Frankenstein we know and love. And back then, all the movies were short films. Frankenstein was 14 minutes. So imagine, and back then you can go to the picture show, they called it back then, and see movies like that for a dime. A dime, that's insane, right? Now you have $13 for a ticket, $10 for popcorn. It's insane. It would cost a dime to see a movie back then. So in 1913, we had our first werewolf movie called The Werewolf. That was an American-made film, but it also, I believe now that movie is lost. A lot of these movies are lost. You can't really find them if you wanted to. You can find some shots and some still shots online, but as far as finding where to buy them, a lot of them are too old and can't really be found. So going into the 1920s, there were a few, but there were two movies that really stood out. One was a German film called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. That movie, what was so good about it was the looks. Back then, all you had was makeup and visuals and looks. They would focus on the eyes. They would zoom in on the eyes to get that menacing look, and that would be terrifying to people. Looking at it now, knowing what we've seen and what we've all experienced, and with all that's happened in horror, it's very, very hard to look back at those movies today and find them scary. I have a tough time watching them. I have completed Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, which I'll get into next. I have watched those two. They are not easy watches, guys. So the earlier black and white films didn't even have dialogue at all. At least when it got to the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, they would speak, and then the next screen would pop up the words of what they said. So you could still read what was going on, and they had classical music playing in the background. But in the earlier movies, all it was visuals. If they were talking, if you can read lips very well, you can figure it out. But other than that, there's not a lot that you could glean from the movie. And going back to the House of the Devil, it was shot in one location. The camera didn't move at all. It was in one spot, and everyone played to that camera. And another thing back then is a lot of these things were set up in play style. They weren't really the movies we've come to know and love. But the groundwork for horror was laid in these, because if you can scare somebody with very little, imagine what you can do if you have more to add on. So one of the things that I love about horror movies, and that I really love for directors to do, is to take those old school tropes and focus on them. It doesn't have to be a lot of blood. It doesn't have to be a lot of over the top gore to be scary. It can be very subtle if done well. Mix it with today's, with today's technology, and it's very, very easy. I say it's easy. Like if you study the craft, it is very, very easy to make a very good horror movie. So after 1920, we go to 1922, and this is Nosferatu. Nosferatu was played by Max Schreck. He was so good in his character, and always came to set in character, that everybody he worked with thought he was a real vampire. This movie got itself into some hot water because Bram Stoker in the 1700s wrote the Dracula novel. This movie was a complete ripoff of the Dracula storyline and didn't give any credit to the novel. So if you were to look for Nosferatu now, you can find it, absolutely, but it lost a lawsuit to the Bram Stoker estate, and a lot of the copies were destroyed, where they had to turn some over. You can still find some. I was able to find one, but it is relatively rare because of everything that went through it. So, notwithstanding, the movie is super important in the horror. If you look at some of these still shots, they played these stills throughout a lot of the horror, like compilations they put together. A lot of like the Halloween style of shows that they would put together would show clips of Nosferatu. And when you look at Max Schreck, when you look at Nosferatu, this movie, he's creepy. He's not the Dracula we know and love that looks like a human being that is suave and tries to woo women to get next to him. This one looks like a creature that you don't want to mess with, and it's in ways it's better done than some of the Draculas. That's it could be personal preference, but I really like this movie a lot. If you guys have not seen that one, if you can stomach it, I mean, they made a remake in 1979 of Nosferatu, which is much easier to watch, and it's a very good movie. I just watched it not too long ago. It's a very good movie, and it's easier to sit through than Nosferatu, and it takes the most adamant of horror fans to really enjoy a silent film. That's just at least my opinion, you know. So, 1923, we had The Hunchback of Notre Dame, starring Lon Chaney Sr., not to be confused with Lon Chaney Jr., his son, who made Wolfman famous. We'll get to that in another video. But Lon Chaney Sr. was really the first American horror icon. He was Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was the Phantom of the Opera. He also he did a good amount of things, but the top two were The Hunchback and The Phantom. The Phantom of the Opera is one of the most important horror movies to ever be made. And what was so awesome about The Phantom of the Opera, which came out in 1925. What was so awesome about that one is, and not just that, all these black and white horror movies, the suspense level was intense. Now, The Phantom of the Opera, if you've seen it, if you have not seen it, the Phantom has a mask for the majority of the movie, and this woman wants to get close to kind of look under the mask, and he always shies away, trying to warn her, you don't want to do this. And of course, she's curious, she wants to see more. And when she finally gets the mask off, the reveal of his face for that time is absolutely horrifying. And if you look at it today, it still looks horrifying. Look at what they had to work with back then. The makeup back then was phenomenal. And a crazier thing, Lon Chaney did his own makeup. He did his own makeup for the Phantom. He did his own makeup for the Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was, when I say a horror icon, he could act, he could do makeup, he could do whatever he wanted to. He was very underrated, and the problem is he was around so long ago, and his son with the Wolfman became such a huge icon that it kind of overshadowed the things that his dad brought forward. But Lon Chaney, when it came to the silent film in America, now I'm not going to say across the board because I don't know the individual actors like that as much in other countries, but in America, when it came to the silent era, Lon Chaney was ahead of the class for that era. He didn't have a lot of movies to his credit, but because he did so much, and the ones that he did do meant so much to horror and laid so much of a groundwork, that he was definitely the most influential character, most influential person in horror during that time. So in 1928, the very last movie we're going to cover, The Man Who Laughs. Funny story about that, or funny thing to know about that. The Man Who Laughs inspired a non-horror character that is super popular, the Joker. The Joker that came in Batman, that started late, in the comics and then went on to TV, was based off of The Man Who Laughs. Now, I have not seen this movie yet. I'm looking for it I'm looking for it now, and I want to get it. Hopefully, the next video I do, I will have seen it. If you've seen this movie, leave a comment. Let me know how it was, because it looks really intriguing, and I'm gonna find it. I'm definitely gonna watch it. But that movie clearly to influence the Joker, even though the Joker's not horror, the Joker is still a gigantic part of society, and he started based off of horror. That's one thing we're going to learn throughout this entire series. Horror has influenced much more than just the genre itself, and it doesn't always get the credit that it deserves. But what a way to to round out the silent film era by having a movie come in that inspired one of the biggest villains in all of comic book, all of cinema, all of television history. You know, so guys, that's my first episode. I hope you guys liked it. I want to know your guys' comments. Been a lot of fun for me to do this. The next one on Sunday is going to be going into the Universal years. Dracula comes into play. The Wolfman comes into play. Invisible Man, The Mummy. All of these movies that laid a solid framework to build upon. The silent film was so sporadic because people were trying to get their footing in horror. So they were putting out different movies that kind of stayed around the monster, devil trope to an extent, but nothing really took off until the Universals. So can't wait to see you guys on Sunday. If you guys like this video, if you're new to this channel, you like this video, leave a like. If you know someone else that like this video, share this video. If you want to see more of this content, subscribe. And I will see you guys next time.